Well, welcome everybody. I'm so happy to see you here, although I can't see you. And Greg and I are delighted to be presenting our talk today, Reducing Grief's Impact at Work, the Business Case for Proactive Planning. And I'm going to start and talk about grief, and then Greg will jump in and tell you what proactive planning really is and how it can help. So let us begin. Did you know that the US loses about $220 billion a year due to grief? Isn't that a staggering number? I couldn't believe it when I heard that. And you may think, really? How come? Well, let's talk about that and see how come. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Carol Bannons. I am a certified grief educator. I am a grief coach, an author, a speaker, and I'm also a widow. And my husband, Brian, died 7 years ago. And honestly, I was shocked by grief. I did not know what it was like. I had no idea the depth and the fact that grief is a whole body experience. And so let's talk about grief a little bit. What is grief? We all know that when somebody dies, we grieve. It's common. It's what we need to. I'm just going to ask Greg, can you just mute for a sec? When somebody dies, we grieve. But what about all the other 40 griefs there are? Job loss, divorce, moving sideways in a company, in an organization, perhaps to some area you didn't want, you now grieve the team that you had. Pet loss, financial loss. We have the loss of physical ability. My background is physiotherapy, physical therapy for those of you in the States. And I saw people all the time who could no longer pick up grandchildren, go skiing, or do the things they loved. That's grief. And so at any one time in Canada, 1 in 30 people are grieving the death of somebody. But if we add in all those other griefs, it turns out to be more like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people are grieving. And if you're at work, you may have no idea of that. You may see their function and their capacity change, but you have no reason why. So let's talk about grief. What happens? Well, I've said it's a whole body experience. In the first 24 hours, after losing a significant person in your life, somebody you love, you are 21 more times likely to have a heart attack. Shocking, right? 21 more times than any other day in your life. And yet, here in Ontario, you are expected to go back to work 2 to 5 days after the death of someone. That's really just a couple of days after this big stress on your heart. We have increased blood pressure. We have the risk of something called Takotsubo syndrome, which is interesting. Takotsubo is an octopus catching pot, and it has a bowl like this. And part of our heart, our left ventricle, can expand like that and then cause problems and death. Very rare, but it can happen. So we have cardiac issues. Even if a parent dies, even if we are expecting our elderly parent to die, the risk of stroke and heart attack goes up 30 and 40%. And if the griever reports that they are really struggling, that this is a very, very significant loss to them, all the stats that I give you go up. So I don't think we talk about grief. I don't think we have an understanding of grief and what happens in our body. So we have that physicality around the heart, but we have the lethargy of grief. I don't know if anybody here has grieved, and if anybody's listening, let me know in the chat. But it is astounding how exhausting grief is. Why is that? Well, because when you grieve, your brain has to get used to the new normal. Normally, perhaps your husband would come in at 6 o'clock through the door and you expect it. Your brain works on prediction. So it knows, well, if he doesn't come home at 6, he's close by. He's probably just stopped off for a drink at the pub or gone to the shops to get something, but he'll be back. But day after day, when your loved one doesn't return home, your brain has to recalibrate, has to rewire, has to get used to the new normal. And this means that it takes up energy. So you've got this energy of your brain trying to figure out what's going on. You've got your heart, you have your respiratory rate that increases, even your inflammatory markers increase. And that means that an old shoulder injury from 20 years ago might flare up, or all of a sudden you've got a new backache. Weren't expecting it. The other thing with the inflammation, which is quite interesting, is that if you have a susceptibility to a disease that you didn't know, maybe MS or rheumatoid arthritis, maybe they run in the family, the grief may be the tipping point. These inflammatory markers may be just enough to now make that disease show itself. So it's profound, the effect of grief on the body physically. And we have appetite changes, we have sleep, we have difficulty sleeping, insomnia, nightmares, or needing to sleep too much. Appetite, as I said, some people can eat, some people can't eat. And so you have a griever who's coming back to work with all these physical changes. Now let's talk about the emotional changes. Of course, they're going to be sad. But what else? Well, there are a lot of these emotions that we don't talk about. Anger, for example. Why would they be angry? Well, perhaps they're angry at the medical system for not saving their loved one. Perhaps they're angry at the drunk driver that hit their loved one. Perhaps they're angry at their loved one for leaving them. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is something in grief that people feel. They feel these strange emotions. Perhaps they feel guilt. If the death was due to a suicide or addiction, then there's a lot of guilt around that, even though there shouldn't be. Why didn't I realize? Why didn't I take their last call? I should have known. I should have done something. All these questions are going on in the griever's mind as they're trying, to cope with this loss. We have shame, we have regret, a whole lot of emotions. And the thing about emotions is they don't just gradually get better on a nice linear scale. If only they did. What tends to happen is you might have a day or two when you're feeling quite good, and then all of a sudden you're hit with what we call a grief burst, a wave of emotion coming over you, and you don't know when it's going to happen. I was talking to a client the other day and she said, I was just getting dressed. It's like grief was lurking in my shoe and it jumped out at me for no reason. And so we have to understand that people coming back to work are going to have this emotional lability. They're going to have a roller coaster. They don't know how they're going to feel, and you don't know how they're going to feel. Nobody quite knows how they're going to react, and that can be very challenging for a team to manage. But what about the cognitive issues? Again, I was shocked. Couldn't read for months. I love reading. Can't focus. People have a hard time reading more than one or two sentences, absorbing information. Perhaps you're telling them something that they need to do, and you have to tell it to them over and over and over. It's just not going in. Remember, that brain is working hard to process what has happened to this person. And so we've got decision making is affected. It's pretty hard if you're a manager, isn't it? And you have to make decisions and tell people what to do. Or if you have a very reading focused job, perhaps you're in a law office, or numbers. How do you focus on that? So we have that. We have this generalized brain fog where just nothing, it's like your brain has gone offline. It's very, very challenging to think when you're in that state and to work, obviously. But what does this all mean for you as an organization? How does this impact you? Well, an interesting number here, because I'm going to give you some stats because I think they bring it home, is that 62% of grievers are actually the executors. So what? Well, turns out when they did a study of executors, 75% of them had panic attacks. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been an executor, but it's really, really hard work. I've done it twice. And one time it was organized and one time not. And it took me 2 years. And somebody just wrote on a post, it took her husband 6 years to sort out the estate of a loved one. It's a long time. And it's a long time to be under the stress of that whilst you're grieving. So executors report feeling symptoms, all of these symptoms like anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping for more than 6 months. It's a long time for them to not be fully present at their work. Many of the executors, 62%, are women and still primary caregivers for other people. So we have the loss, the death, or whatever is causing the grief. Then we have this job as executor on top of it. How does that then relate back to the workplace? Well, we have something called presenteeism, which is your people come back to work and it's like they're home but the lights aren't on. They're not really there. They might be staring at the computer. They may be just shuffling papers at their desk. They can't focus. How can they? Somebody just died. And the studies show that in the first month after the loss, people are only 25% able to function. And although it increases steadily, at 6 months, they're only at about 65%. So even 6 months down the road, they are not functioning very well. And we have to think, well, how does that impact everybody else? Well, perhaps meetings are being missed. Perhaps client calls are being missed. Perhaps they're being moody and it's difficult and relationships are pretty strained. And people have to take up the slack. Others are trying to make things go smoothly. And that's fine, isn't it, for a week or two? We can all do that. We're happy to do that. But when we have this lack of understanding of grief, of really what's going on, then it seems hard for us to keep doing that for 6 months or for a year. Because it's not like grief goes away. Grief stays with us. We have to learn how to live with it in our personal lives and with our work lives. And if, I think it's 5% of people choose to leave because they just can't manage coming back to work, it is going to cost the organization 50 to 60% of that person's salary. So if you have an employee who earns $60,000 a year, your organization is going to spend $30,000 to $36,000 to try and find a replacement. That's in recruitment, that's in picking up mistakes, that's in other people taking up the slack, in overtime, in all of these things, in advertising. So it costs a lot when somebody leaves. And they actually are absent more often. 22 days in the first 6 months. On average, a griever is going to take that time off. So your team is under a lot of stress. You've got a griever who comes back and they're not really functioning. They can't, even if they want to. And I can speak to this because I very stupidly went back to work 3 days after my husband's funeral. And I went back into a workplace that was nurturing and caring. And yet I didn't realize the impact myself on the grief. And I went from seeing 6 patients a day to 5 to 4 to 3. And over 3 years, I burnt out because really what I was doing was trying to push down all those grief emotions that I've talked about just so that I could go to work, so I could show up and say, I'm fine. And this is what grievers are doing just to try and get back to work. And so, of course, it's important that we create grief policies, and that's a whole different talk that perhaps we can come to at another time. But we need to be aware of what is going on in the griever. Remember, it's a whole body experience, and that they'll get these grief bursts for months, years, actually, years. You have the anniversary of the death. Nobody at work probably will remember, but it's a big deal for the griever, and it will affect their productivity. We've already heard that if a griever is an executor, it's also going to be very, very challenging for them to turn up and do a good job at work. So what sort of things can we do to help? Now, it's not really if grief happens. You know it's when grief happens. It's going to happen to us all in some form or another. You may know about it, or it may be a hidden grief that people aren't talking about. But there are things that we can do. Yes, grief policies, but also something called proactive planning. And I am so excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Greg Barnsdale. And he is a seasoned funeral director. He is a certified executor advisor. I knew I'd trip up. He is a certified financial planner and he's a death doula. What combination of things, and what insight are we going to get about what proactive planning is and why it's important? And more than that, Greg has a really personal story that he is going to share with you that really, I think, brings home the fact that it's going to happen. Something is going to happen, something unexpected that we don't know about. And are we prepared? And can we somehow alleviate the stress on the loved ones that are left after we die? So, Greg, I am going to hand this over to you right now. Welcome.
Thank you, Carol. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good, good. Well, you have brought up so much valuable information in regards to the aspects that you have been trained on and see so often in your practice. And you're exactly right. The aspect of trying to avoid grief is not possible. We all have to face it at some point, and death will happen, unfortunately, to those around us, but it is all part of the circle of life. But as a young man, when I joined the funeral industry back in the 80s, I saw firsthand as a funeral director that the situations where families were prepared with what was going to happen, in other words, the deceased had proactively talked about what they wanted to have happen and had planned for it and possibly even paid for their funeral and had a will and all those sorts of things. The situation for the survivors was just so much easier for them. But those types of situations were relatively few and far between compared to the vast majority of situations where the families were unprepared and they didn't know what to do and they didn't know necessarily what the deceased wanted. And that really stuck with me. And over the years, as I worked for various funeral homes, I found that actually when I left the funeral industry and joined the financial planning industry, I found the same sorts of things in regards to people not wanting to talk about these types of events or the bad things potentially ruining a good retirement. But as a certified financial planner, we are mandated to discuss these sorts of things with our clients and to make sure that they fully understand that there are risks that could ruin a good retirement. And a disability, a critical illness, a premature death could certainly ruin the retirement that they were hoping to have. But what I found frustrating was whether I was in the funeral industry or the financial planning industry, there were a fair number of people that just didn't want to discuss these sorts of things. And that's what compelled me to write this book that is behind me, behind my shoulder. Do Not Ignore Your Mortality, Practical Advice from a Funeral and Financial Insider. I wrote this book after carefully considering the fact that most people, again, don't want to discuss these things, but I wanted to write a compelling book that I felt people would actually read and more so do something about, to take action, to pull out their will and read the darn thing. And if they don't have a will, to understand the risks and the turmoil and problems that they would be leaving for those that they love. My book is starting to gain solid traction, and it is inspiring people to do just that. But again, it is a very tough topic for people to talk about. I totally respect the fact that that is the case. But people like Carol and I, what we are trying to do, we're trying to elevate these conversations and inspire more people to get talking about them. We're not going to be able to change the fact that death will happen in our world at some point. But what I'm now sharing with people in interviews as I give them, I'm stressing these core facts that I believe are the most inspiring way to engage people into this process, to lean into a state and end-of-life planning while minds are clear and time is plentiful. I stress to them that end-of-life planning helps reduce the stress of aging. It tends to leave survivors more financially and emotionally resilient. It tends to leave them in a place where they are more likely to get along after the death and less likely to contest final wishes. The process naturally results in more meaningful legacies It takes immense pressure off the courts from otherwise having to deal with so many unorganized estates, and often helps charities because of the immense tax planning benefits of planned giving. And all these things cumulatively help bolster the economy. It's a massive win for everyone with really no downside. The challenge, though, is inspiring people to have these conversations while they have the opportunity. And I've heard from many people that older people tend to lean into estate planning because they know that the risk of death is actually higher as we age. And yes, that's common knowledge, obviously. But from someone who has worked on the front lines of the funeral industry, as I have for years, I have seen so many situations where an unexpected death had taken place and the family members were wringing their hands, not knowing what to do, because the conversations that should have been had when times were good and they had the opportunity just did not take place. And that's why it's so vitally important for us to control what we can in this whole topic. And that topic is being proactive by having a will, speaking with our family members about what we want to have happen. Because when the time comes and a death does take place or a serious health issue gets in the way, our family will know what we want to have happen. They will know where the documentation is. They will know what needs to be done and what we want it to be done. Now, Carol, you mentioned a short time ago that I faced a health challenge, and that is precisely the case. 2 months after I published my book, I was diagnosed with a large brain tumor. I was very surprised and shocked, actually, that when my general physician told me this, actually, I didn't tell my wife for 3 days, and that was a mistake on my part. When I did tell her, not knowing if it was cancerous or not, I recorded a brief video on my phone, not knowing if I would show it to anyone, and I put it on social media and it went viral. That one video on TikTok has been viewed over 1.7 million times. But isn't it funny how that little story about my brush with death attracted so much attention, but on the opposite side of the coin, only about half of the adult population of Canada has a valid will. And out of all those wills that are in place, many of those are so out of date that they will cause problems at the time they're needed. And far fewer people have a medical directive in place. So there's a lot of work to be done. And that's why Carol and I are organizing this type of information to help people in all walks of life to realize the fact that we can't control death and grief, but what we can control and should be leaning into is being proactive so that we can ultimately set up our loved ones in the best possible position, regardless of the size of our bank account. At a very bare minimum, our family members should know what we want done with our body, as an example, whether we want to be buried or cremated or recycled or composted or turned into fireworks. If they don't know that basic information, it can cause a lot of grief at a very delicate time. So Carol, I'll turn it back over to you. I think I've covered the gist of my message. There might be some more that is not coming to mind here at the moment, but I see some comments in the side here, which is great to see that people are finding this helpful.
Yeah, I think relating it to the workplace for me is really important, because grief is so profound, and it really is something that as a society, right, Greg, we don't talk about as is clear, because people don't want to talk about having a will or what they want done. And yet it's one of the greatest gifts that we can give our loved ones by doing that. And in doing that, when you're in grief and you have to go back to work, it's just one less thing for you to worry about. If you have a will in place, if you have all the I's and the T's crossed and the I's dotted, it means that that's just one less thing. Because remember, I said that 75% of executors are having panic attacks. How are they going to work in the workforce. They're not. And I think the thing I want to educate people on is that don't expect your grieving employees to come back and be back to normal in their 2 to 5 days. In 6 months, they may not be. About 60 to 70% of grievers are what we call resilient grievers. They will come back and gradually improve and do well. And that's a good majority of people. But some don't. Some really struggle to function. And if we can, by preempting this, by proactive planning and getting wills in place, we can decrease that stress. So as an organization, as we start to talk about grief policies, let's start talking to people about things like wills, having somebody like Greg come in and saying, this is what you need to do. This will actually impact the well-being of your whole organization. So I think it's really important that we understand that this is a pre-grief thing that we're doing for people who probably think that I'm fine, I'm only 30, I'm not going to die. We all know car accidents happen, things happen, brain tumors happen. So for your employees, how nice would it be to encourage them as part of your well-being package to get their wills sorted, to get their POA organized, to get their medical medical POA also, as well as a financial one, so that it is just less stressful when something happens. It is a gift that you can give your employees to encourage them to do this. Anything else you want to say on that, Greg? Is there anything you would add?
Well, this whole preparedness message, as we're saying, Carol, just simply does make it so much easier after something major has happened, whether that is a serious illness and someone is hospitalized and needs a fiduciary to step in and make decisions for them, or after a death. And that's really the best way for us to be able to set up our affairs so that those that we love have an easier time with all of this and can ultimately get through the aftermath easier.
Yeah.
And that's really the only solution.
What happens if somebody doesn't have a will? Can you tell us briefly what happens then, and how that's going to affect somebody? What do they have to go through if there's no will?
Well, if someone dies intestate without a will, or the will is not valid, the court where they lived needs to be involved. And the court will basically decide who the administrator is going to be of that estate. And it draws it out. It makes it much longer. The jurisdictional rules of that jurisdiction therefore apply in regards to who is to receive the proceeds of the estate and how it is to be settled. But like most things in life, if we are proactive and we have a will, or we have a business agreement with a business partner, or we have an agreement in place, a prenuptial agreement is another form of common agreement. If we are proactive that way and think through these things as to how we want things to play out based on our particular situation, we in essence keep the government out of our affairs.
And everybody wants to do that, right?
That's right.
I mean, let's be honest. And I say, I've been an executor for two different types of situation. One where the person had Alzheimer's and it was a nightmare. And the other was my husband, where we were organized because I'd organized him. And I was very lucky that my brother and sister did the executive duties for my mother in the UK. And, when you can trust the people who are the executors, that's another thing. Like it's such a big thing to do. So I hope this has sort of at least made people think, geez, I better get my will up to date, or I better have that conversation. And I know somebody said in one of my posts, this is, my parents are not very eager to have a conversation. First of all, get Greg's book, that will help you. But secondly, I would approach it and just say, listen, I know you love us. Do this for us to make it easier on us. We need to know. Do you want to be buried or cremated? It's a basic thing. But if it's not written down somewhere, somebody doesn't know. So have those conversations, be brave enough, do it gently, do it kindly, do it with compassion. Understand that it is awkward for people. Some people are not very open, but just keep nudging, just keep coming back to it with love and see if you can get that sorted out. And if you are an organization, I would urge you to think about encouraging your employees to start thinking about wills and pre-planning, just to make it a little easier when they come back, because it's hard enough with all that stuff that I've already told you. So thank you, Greg, so much for sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody who's been here and who's on the replay. And we'll see you at our next free stream, whenever that may be.